Hi everybody, you're watching White Mountains today. I'm Chris Proulx. After a series of high-profile search and rescues here in the White Mountains, we decided to invite in Sergeant Alex Lopashanski of New Hampshire Fish and Game, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what goes into these search and rescues and how to keep us all safe on the hiking trails in winter here in the White Mountains. So thank you, first of all, for coming into our studio today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. I mean, over the course of the years, there have been a lot of rescues like this, like we mentioned, and recently there have been a few, unfortunately, that ended with fatalities. And anything we can do to get the message out and help people be prepared and avoid these kinds of situations is helpful. So, offering us this platform to do that is a great help, and we appreciate it.
All right. Well, let's talk about an overview of what happened. We've had a few kind of high-profile incidents in the past couple of months, maybe even 3 or more, of people who have gone out on what turns out to be a winter hike, whether they think it's going to be winter or not when they get above tree line. And unfortunately, in some of these cases, they haven't returned, and a search and rescue has turned into a search and recovery. A couple of these most recent ones have happened on the Franconia Ridge, which is kind of a long, above tree line ridge on the western side of the mountains. Why this location, do you think? What is unique or special about this location that it's been the site of so many tragedies?
I think the Franconia Ridge can become a problem for people for a couple of different reasons. One, it's directly on Route 93, which is easy access when you're coming from the south. So it's a popular destination for people all times of the year because it's got relatively easy access, and the trails, you can go up on the Franconia Ridge and knock out 2 to 3 different 4,000 foot peaks. So if people are trying to complete all the 4,000 footers, it's an extremely popular hike, and the access is easy there. Where people run into problems, I think, is even if they have experience in the mountains, other seasons, that ridge is particularly exposed to the wind. Even though the elevation is relatively low, I think Mount Lafayette is about 5,200 and some feet. So it's 1,000 feet in elevation smaller than Mount Washington. So that may lull people into a false sense of security because it's not the biggest mountain. But you certainly do ascend rather rapidly to a point where you're above tree line, and then, like you mentioned, you're following a ridge which is above tree line, and the weather can be vastly different on that ridge. Not only the temperature, wind, and visibility, to the point where it's difficult to follow the trail. And if you have not experienced those types of conditions, winter conditions in the White Mountains can be present in any month of the year. But certainly once we get into the fall, winter conditions are there.
Right.
And if you haven't experienced that in doses before, I think a lot of people get up there, they get on that ridge, they either want to continue or they realize they're kind of stuck in those conditions, so they have to continue. And if you're not prepared for it at that point, it's kind of too late.
Right. I think one of the things people are inspired by social media these days. Everybody is posting pictures. You can see firsthand how beautiful it is up there, and even for some people, it's like a badge. If they go up in winter, they'll post their winter summits, and maybe sometimes those don't give the full picture of what it is like to summit one of these mountains in winter, especially when the weather turns bad. We were talking earlier about, let's go into like the most recent search and rescue. So Christmas Day, or was it Christmas Eve or Christmas Day?
Yeah, it was. The gentleman began his hike on Christmas Eve day, yes.
And you got a call on late Christmas Eve?
Yeah, I think it was shortly after 9:30 at night on Christmas Eve.
And so what was this hiker's plan, and what was the call that came in?
The call went to, since the Franconia Ridge is in District 3, it's on the western side of the state, it went to the lieutenant for that district, Jim Nealon, and he's also the advanced search and rescue team leader. He got a call And essentially the information was, and if whether people are familiar with it or not, there's several programs that you can track your friend's phone on, you can track anyone's phone on. So he had family members from outside the country who were actually tracking his phone during this hike. They had a coordinate for it on the ridge, on the Franconia Ridge. That was the last coordinate they had, and they hadn't been active since 6 p.m. that evening. So there were several different possibilities. His phone may have went dead and he continued on the trail and he's fine, but by that point he should be out, or he may be stuck at that point or in trouble somewhere. So essentially he called, Jim, the lieutenant, called myself and one other officer to go hike this gentleman's route in reverse, which would be up Falling Waters across the ridge and down the bridle path.
Right.
He was hiking that loop clockwise, and we were going to do it counterclockwise, hoping that, for whatever reason he was delayed or possibly injured on the Falling Waters trail, like we've had so many other slip and falls there before, and he was just going to need some assistance to get out. But it was our job basically to go locate him and find out what else we would need for manpower. So we started off on our own by ourselves.
And when you get there, what do you discover right off the bat? What are the weather conditions? How's the the hike up, and what are your first thoughts? How is this rescue or recovery going to go?
Over the years, I've learned not to guess what the outcomes are to be, to just follow the plan. You can have all kinds of ideas of where you might find someone, but people will do things that are super smart, and people will do things that kind of boggle the mind. And they've, in both categories, they've come out both alive and or dead. So you can't really predict it. I mean, we had a pretty good plan based on what at least we knew his itinerary. He was alone, and that's unfortunate. When people hike with partners, it allows them to carry much more gear. If one person gets injured, the other person can always call for help. But solo hiking in the wintertime is probably the most risky choice you can take, unless you have a lot of experience with it in the past. So the fact that he was solo and the fact that no one had heard from him in a long time led me to believe he was probably either hurt, or incapacitated in some other way. But so it was cold. I don't know what the temperature was on the ridge, but I think Mount Washington, we kind of go off what the observatories got up there, and I think they were getting 50 to 60 mile an hour winds that night. And
you are setting off at night, so it
was dark,
pitch black with your lights.
Shortly before 11 o'clock till I got over there. But and when I came across the Kank, the thermometer on my truck at the height of land, it's like 2,900 feet there. It was like 4 degrees.
Wow.
So you got another 2,000. So it was probably somewhere around zero, and the ridge, the winds were solid, but I've seen it much worse. So they probably were in a 30 to 40 mile an hour range pretty consistently. But, we hiked up the Falling Waters Trail with no sign. The conditions were pretty good, actually. There was a fresh light powder on the sides of the trail when we were inside tree line, and as we're going, we're looking for places, in hazardous areas along that trail where we may have slipped and fell or lost the trail. We didn't find any sign of that on the way up. Stopped before tree line, added layers, and as we progressed along the trail above tree line, there were some tracks in places where snow had actually accumulated, wasn't blown off by the wind, and we did find a spot where it looked like someone had left the trail and gone down. And we've kind of looked around and found those tracks. Once we got inside the short spruces, you could definitely see that someone had gone down there. So we radioed below and let Lieutenant Nealon know that we were pretty confident that we were on his tracks and we'd be following down the drainage. And we gave him our coordinates so that he's able to locate us and pinpoint us on the map. And then he started 2 additional people to come up the Falling Waters Trail and then enter that drainage that we were headed towards from below, so that hopefully, if he was down near the bottom, those guys would get to him quicker and we could find him and help him. After several hours of following the tracks down the drainage, it became very tight, and basically forced into open water creek in areas. So, and we've seen this a lot. When you're on the ridge in the wind and your clothes are not quite prepared for it. Hiking up in the wintertime, obviously you're going to sweat, so you're going to be wet. So irregardless of whether or not there's precipitation, you're going to be damp. And you need to either get rid of those layers and change them, or add enough other shell layers and warm layers to be able to maintain your body temperature. But leaving the trail and going off trail on the sides of these mountains is a trap. It can take hours to go a mile sometimes, depending on the snow conditions. Fortunately, these snow conditions were relatively decent because they had some rain up there, and it was mostly hard and frozen, so you weren't post-holing like you would. You weren't slogging through snow up to your waist. Those are the times when people get stuck and they just can't move. So he was able to make some ground. But unfortunately, by the time we had found him, he had succumbed to what certainly appeared to be hypothermia, a cold weather injury, and there was nothing we could do. But
it seems like this is a common thing that hikers will do above tree line in the face of the wind. Like, your instinct is to get shelter from the wind, to just get off that trail, especially if you've been out there for a while and you're starting to hurt. Was that one of the thoughts you had when you got above tree line, that you'll probably find him in one of these drainages?
It's definitely a possibility, because it's happened many times over the years, where people have done exactly that. They may go into the wind to get out of the trees. They may go on the opposite side of the mountain to get out of the wind, but the wind is the big factor, because it makes it difficult sometimes you just can't even see where you're going with the snow blowing and everything around. The whiteout conditions can be extremely difficult, and the wind can be strong enough to knock you down.
Right.
So the conditions are punishing, and if you haven't experienced them in doses, or gone with people who can say, hey, this is nice stuff that you have here, but it's not the stuff you need for today. You need X, Y, and Z. So there's no substitute for experience,
right?
Because it is hard to imagine, even though it's chilly out at the trailhead, what a massive difference the weather conditions are in that 3 miles from the trailhead to the tree line, and then from the tree line to the top of the ridge.
Right.
Though the swings in weather can be just devastating.
So if you could give one piece of advice to someone who is thinking about doing some winter hiking, they see some of these photos, that people are putting on Instagram or Facebook of these beautiful vistas from the top of the Franconia Ridge, and they say, I want to experience that. Would it be just that, doses, and go with someone?
Yeah, do not go by yourself, because that second person, who's hopefully more experienced, is going to immediately recognize the shortcomings in either your equipment or your physical ability.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And it seems like people are getting fitter and fitter, and the physical fitness component hasn't been as bad lately. But certainly being caught underprepared with gear that is nice, there's nothing wrong with it, but not appropriate for the weather.
Yep.
When we're up there, fortunately we're outfitted with equipment that you could wear on Mount Everest and be comfortable. We're not dealing with the altitude, obviously, but you're dealing in some instances with the same kinds of winds and temperature differences that can freeze your toes, fingers, feet, face, put you into hypothermia relatively quickly.
Yep.
And
So in addition to this recovery, there was also a recovery, I think, back in November of a young woman, kind of similar situation. Are there mistakes that these people have made in common? Obviously, going in doses. I don't think either one was really an experienced winter hiker. Are there things that may have increased their odds of survival if they had them either in the pack or on their bodies?
Yep, I think. I don't want to second guess, but the earlier one, the young lady from Massachusetts who unfortunately passed away that you brought up there, that day there was a snow squall in the middle of the afternoon. The weather wasn't particularly cold. I mean, it was chilly and it was windy, but there was a snow squall around noon that even in town, it was a complete whiteout when I was driving in my truck. So I can't imagine the conditions that she faced there, and it seemed like she turned back possibly once she realized it. But up above tree line, you know, it's just a big rocky mess, and in a whiteout, it can be extremely difficult to navigate. So having a GPS, a handheld GPS, people shouldn't try to navigate with their phones. I know there's some apps out there these days that work very well, but your phone is for taking pictures and for emergency calls. If it's out in the cold, it's going to freeze. If you're running it for other things, your battery's going to die. So having a handheld GPS that's operating off a satellite that will work regardless of whether or not you have cell phone signal, a compass and a paper map so that you can orient yourself. And if you do get off trail, you can get yourself back to it.
Yep.
So those three things are key for navigating, and having that second person, because it's hard to do all these things by yourself when the weather's not great.
Yep.
You know, and even the most experienced hikers can run into problems, and having a second person there to assist you can make your life a lot better.
Yep. What about light? Did these people have light? Because obviously at this time of year, you don't get very much daylight. And I think the first person that we've been talking about, his itinerary, I think he started off at like 11 a.m. or something like that,
Yep.
which there's really no, I think in summer, in good conditions, it's an 8-hour trek
Right.
that he was attempting to do, which meant he was definitely coming down in dark. Did he have the proper light? Because I imagine in high winds with blowing snow and it's pitch dark, your orientation is just completely off.
I didn't physically inventory his equipment, somebody else did, but I followed his trail through the woods, and there was no way that he took the path that he did and avoided the trees and some of the pitfalls without some sort of light source. So he was using some sort of light source, whether it was recovered or not. As I turned my headlamp off a couple times just to see if I could do what he had done.
Yeah.
But it was way too thick and there was way too many obstacles. So he was certainly navigating with some sort of light source, the second gentleman. The first young lady, I don't think, she had left very early in the morning, so she had plenty of daylight, but she did not. So, but those basic things, you know, my pack does not leave my truck without a headlamp, regardless of what time of day it is, because I don't know what's going to happen between A and B and I get back. You know, so obviously light sources are extremely important, and then proper clothing, food, water. And in the wintertime, it's more difficult to eat, it's more difficult to drink, so thermoses, you know, heated liquids that can increase your body temperature rather than decrease them when you drink them. So there's a million different things that you can do, and there's also fantastic guide services all throughout New Hampshire. If this is something that you're interested in, you know, they offer courses, you know, in winter mountaineering as well as guided hikes. So you can learn a lot from a course we're lucky around here to have extremely experienced mountaineers that have gone all over the world to pursue their craft. And then we have that talent pool right here that people can learn from.
Right. Well, Sergeant Alex Lopashanski of New Hampshire Fish and Game, thank you so much for coming on and sharing the story, and also some tips for those of us who may want to get out onto some of our mountains in winter, but they are not to be taken lightly, for sure. And if you see Sergeant Lopashanski out in the street, give him a big thumbs up. This was kind of inspired by your wife's social media post, who showed pictures of you, what it's like to get the call on a Christmas Eve night and have to go out into these harsh conditions, because one person's error on the trail affects so many, and sometimes it sounds like you had a small crew that night, but sometimes it is scores of volunteer search and rescue who are very experienced, but at the same time they're going out sometimes into these conditions that are, like you said, Everest without the altitude.
Yep, and I mean, we talked about the one you just mentioned, the most recent one, but like you said, there's, irregardless of whether or not it's Christmas, unfortunately this happens quite a bit, and it's not just us. There's all kinds of volunteer groups throughout the state, and like I said, people with tons of mountaineering experience who come out and volunteer their skills, their time, and their experience to try to keep people safe in the mountains.
Yep. And this happens across the mountains too. We've been talking about Franconia Ridge, but obviously the Presidential Range, and even I think there was like a little rescue right behind North Conway Village on Peaked Mountain, a month ago, where someone hurt themselves. So it happens, and we're fortunate to have experts like you on the field who respond. So thank you very much for what you do.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
All right. Sergeant Alex Lopashanski, New Hampshire Fish and Game. You've been watching White Mountains TV.